to another episode of Coffee with Alissa. I'm back with Nancy Bells for the third session of our behavioral finance series. And today we'll be discussing marriage and finance. Welcome back, Nancy. How are you?
I'm good, Alissa. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's good to see you again.
Yeah. Hey, and again, another good topic, finances related to marriage. It's really important when couples are considering getting married, throughout marriage, and even when they're pondering divorce. And when I looked at some of the list of the top conflicts in marriage, money was on every top list. So, and also one of the things we know is that when individuals come into a relationship, they're typically coming in already with sort of their own financial personality. And that's sort of a constitution of their beliefs, their habits, and their patterns around finances. And these typically get their anchor or they're rooted in the examples that they see from their parents or other influential people in their lives. And it's either the adoption of those or sometimes it's the rejection of what they've seen. And then the personality is further refined throughout the journey of life by social groups, and that can even be in early childhood or in high school, and that by educational choices, by employment choices, by economic status, and then also by phases of life.
So what are some of the financial personalities that you've seen?
I'm going to share a couple different ones I found because they cut the pie a lot of different ways when we're looking at financial personalities. And so the simplest one I saw was savers, spenders, and sharers. The pie is sliced three ways. I saw a further refinement where they cut the pie into five slices: investors, savers, big spenders, debtors, and shoppers. And final one I'll share, but there's many more out there. And I sort of like this one. The personalities were defined by being an achiever, an enthusiast, an analyst, or a steward. And again, not necessarily that any of these are the ways I would want to look at it, but a lot of different ways to look at financial personalities.
Yeah. And are some of these personalities better than others? Is there a preferred personality?
There's not necessarily a preferred one, at least in my opinion. But where I do worry is if somebody is extreme on any end. If there's an extremism, if they're really far on the edges, that sometimes that needs to be brought into balance, because moderation is more the key to making this all work individually or together as a couple. And even when I was looking at the personalities, I realized that I find it actually somewhat more beneficial to actually look at those underlying beliefs, patterns, and habits that individuals have, and then how they come together as a couple.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, it's so important to understand these things about yourselves and your partner, because when you come under periods of stress, whether it's, having a baby or changing a job or losing a job or, anything like that, it's like
Yes.
really can exacerbate any kind of personality trait or, inherent characteristic.
Definitely. And it is under stress, and often it's under stress where it's really critical that we are balanced and in moderation.
Yeah. And having that understanding, right, the self-awareness and the others awareness, right, we can maybe, I guess, see things a little bit more clearly versus like, oh my goodness, where did that come from?
Right. Definitely. Yeah.
So what are some of the habits and the patterns that you're referencing?
Well, the first one, and you just mentioned it, the word in a different context that I like to talk about, is awareness, like financial awareness. And this has to do with, like, are we someone that even looks at a price? Are we someone that checks the receipt before we sign the credit card receipt at a restaurant? Are we someone that's aware of what we're paying on a monthly basis for our cell phone? Are we aware of our monthly cash flow? In the example I like to give, and this was a somewhat extreme one, but not that far off the mark, was with a couple where the wife shared that she and her husband had been at a restaurant, and nice restaurant, had a good dinner, and when the bill came and he was getting ready to pay it, he looked at the bill and said, "Oh my goodness, my New York strip cost X, let's say $60." And she looked at him and she said, "Yep, that was the price that was on the menu." And he said, "I didn't even notice," and she said, "Please notice from now on." And the thing is, it should, it's just that awareness. So it doesn't mean you won't do it or not do it, but just so we avoid those kinds of surprises. Next one I like to look at is financial knowledge. And on this one, it's the notion of what knowledge do we already have inherent? Like some people are raised and they have a lot of good financial knowledge, or they learn it in school or whatever. And then how are we about acquiring new knowledge to help us along the way? And when we talked before, the first time we talked, I talked about a bias called self-attribution. And that has to do when there's an overconfidence in what we think we know already. And I see this sometimes with finances, where an example I'll give you is that I was working with a client not too long ago who regularly goes to support an adult child out of state in her family, that it's far enough away, I think it's in Texas or Louisiana, that it's a plane ride. And something came up and they were going to have to go quickly. And so they said, well, I'm just going to have to drive. I know it'll take 2 days, but I'm sure at this point in time, an airline ticket would cost an arm and a leg. And so I pulled out my handy dandy computer, because we all have a computer with us at all times. And I said, "Hey, let me just check." And I put it in and I said, "Hey, it looks to me like they are pretty reasonably priced. If you still want to drive, go ahead and do it. But I really encourage people to be good about acquiring knowledge or double checking." And some people are resistant. Some people are stubborn. I know, they'll say, I know what I know. But this plays then into financial decision making. How am I someone that just makes things a gut decision based on prior knowledge? Big decisions should be iterated. What are the individual patterns, and how do they come together as a couple? Next one is openness and communications about finances. And here's where, especially coming into a marriage, is sometimes people are not open about spending or financial patterns that they think their potential spouse might not be happy with or concerned about. And also throughout the marriage, we want there to be an openness about what our spending and financial habits are, and an openness that we regularly talk about it. And an example that comes to mind here was a case where there was somebody who was getting married, and they had an existing medical debt. It was legitimate. It was something they were working hard on, but they felt uncomfortable and frightened about sharing it with their spouse, and just sort of said, "Hey, if this person is not going to be open and accepting of your challenge, I'm not so sure you should be marrying them." And I'll mention with that too, and we'll be touching on this later too, I think, is that working with a financial advisor creates a space of more openness, because you can ask those questions. It's information you probably regularly get from clients. So that's, working with someone creates more openness, I think. Then I'll just fly through a few more. Spending habits. Knowing, like, are you a big spender? Are you someone that loves shopping? Are you someone that thinks we should always buy the highest quality? Are you someone that thinks we should always buy the cheapest? I like to joke, are you someone that has a DoorDash habit? Really add up. Sharing habits. What are my own individual patterns around making contributions to my church, to charities? What are my sharing habits with gift giving? And there can really be a big divide on that. And also, what are my sharing habits? Like if I'm out to dinner with a group of friends, am I someone that regularly would like to pick up the bill for everyone? Because I've seen that be a conflict in marriage before. Couple more approaches to debt. How do I feel about credit card debt, mortgage debt, car payments, and finally, just saving and investment patterns. Where I'm at there, and where we come together as a couple. So that's a lot. That's a lot of different things, but they're all important.
Oh, they are all extremely important. And I think communication plays a huge role in this. But do you think it's best if a couple has the same or similar financial personalities, or, is it okay to have different personalities?
It's not necessarily better to have the same. I think that if you can come to agreement on some core ways you handle finances, that's always good. But sometimes we see different personalities can actually be complementary. And the one that comes up the most is sometimes like somebody might be the enthusiast, that they come up with the good ideas. And then the other spouse might be the one who is the analyst who figures it out. Someone might say, hey, I think we should consider doing this. And the other one will say, well, let me look into it and I'll share what I find out. I also like to ask couples that if there's something new they're considering, which of you has your foot on the gas and which of you has your foot on the brake? Mm-hmm. And that can work out well as long as, often it's good to tap the gas and someone tapping the brakes. But if it's like screeching back and forth, that's not good.
No, definitely not. So how do you suggest that couples work together on finances, especially if they do have, differing money personalities?
Yeah. With that, early on, I just encourage that they agree that they're going to regularly talk about the important financial things in their life, that they set aside a regularly scheduled time and that they stick with it. Because often, if people don't have a regularly scheduled time, the discussion's not going to happen, because often there's the concern that there's going to be conflict or disagreement, and most people try and avoid that. I often talk to that you want to create this as a space of collaboration and openness. So I don't want it to be a space where it's a tug of war. Like if I hear someone say, yeah, I'm glad we're going to talk about money this week so I can try and convince my wife that we need to do X. Mm-hmm. That's not, it would be that I want to present to her that I have this idea and get her input on it. So collaboration, openness, not tug of war.
Yeah, absolutely. I think starting any conversation that, could be controversial or a disagreement with, hey, I want to work on this as a team.
Yeah.
Versus, hey, you spent this money and we need to talk about it.
Right. Right.
Maybe we're facing this issue, balancing the budget. Let's work on this as a team.
Right.
Like you said, kind of eliminates that tug of war issue.
Right. And also, again, if it's scheduled and you stick with it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I know we do that. My husband and I meet monthly. We do our budget for the coming month. We also, review. I print out a spreadsheet, that's broken down, groceries, gas, things like that. And we review kind of where we were, where we're headed. And I think having those conversations is so important, especially if one person manages the finances.
Yes. Yes.
It's really good to be knowledgeable, and that's I think that's
and intentional. You know what I mean? Like if people that will say, well, I just don't even want to be worrying about money. And I'll say, I'm not talking about worrying about money. I'm talking about being intentional.
Absolutely. It's very important.
Yeah.
It's very
without a doubt.
Well, how do you see a financial advisor supporting couples as they have these conversations?
The one thing is I really encourage folks to early on get connected with a financial advisor. I think a lot of people have an assumption in their mind that you get a financial advisor when you have a big enough pot of assets to be managed. Mm-hmm. And as you know, your role as a financial advisor is much broader than that, and so I think that a financial advisor can be critical to help people understand the implication of their decisions, both on their current financial situation and into the future, to find that balance. I also think that if there is a conflict over a significant financial decision, that a financial advisor can be a good third-party person to be part of the conversation, to bring fact and options to the table that might be obscured by the couple's emotions if they're just talking to each other.
Yeah, I think we've had opportunities to bring up in the realm of financial planning a lot of questions or conversations that people just haven't thought to have. And we read a study a long time ago, or I think it was last year, and then we did a video on it, just of why people with advisors tend to be happier, especially couples. And the study really showed it was because these conversations that really aren't natural to have, as a couple, are being had and questions are being posed and brought up that wouldn't otherwise be brought up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I bet you do a little bit of on the side counseling in these sessions in a way too. You know what I mean? I know that's not the main thing, but I'm sure that comes up, you know?
Yeah, it's really important, even down to things like, are we paying for our kids' college or not? Or
Right.
I mean, it's a lot of different things that come up, but I think it really, financial planning for couples, I think, is so important to get everybody on the same page so that
Yes.
that trajectory stays in place.
Right. Yeah.
What are some of the areas that are important for couples to discuss and be intentional about?
You know, with this one, I'm going to start with the notion of when couples are going into marriage. It varies among couples, but often there's sort of assumptions that individually they have in their mind, but they don't openly discuss. And I just really like to push an open discussion about it. And it's not making a decision, but some of these things, it's sort of like almost like at this point in time, where do we plan to live after we get married? At this point in time, are we considering ever leaving the Western Pennsylvania area? At this point in time, how do we feel about having kids? At this point in time, if we have kids, are we assuming that we would both be working or not? At this point in time, do we want to pool our finances or do we want to do it differently? I've run across so many cases where somebody will say, well, I just assumed we would do it this way. You know, and so I really just want to make sure that assumptions are spoken. And it's not a final decision, though. Throughout marriage, it's often at this point in time, what are our thoughts on this? You know, I never want anyone to put something down in concrete to never change, you know. But then throughout the marriage, and you mentioned some of these, you know, some of the things I really like for couples to be intentional about on their own, and if they need support from the financial advisor, is budgeting and spending plans like you and your husband do, funding an emergency fund, how we want to use credit card and debt, our savings and investment plans, and that would be general, retirement, children's education, major purchases and expenditures like a home, cars, recreational vehicles, major remodeling. And then the last category I have on the list, but there's more here, is spending related to kids. And we know, I forget what the number is on how much on average it costs for each child to raise them through the age of 22 or whatever, but I'm just going to tell you, there's a lot of space in there to be making decisions. And so I really like couples to be intentional to talk about the activities that we get our kids in. And right now, you know, back in my day when I was raising kids, if I put them into soccer, it was $60 for the fall season and that was it. In this day and age, if your kid's in soccer and they're good and whatever, you're going to be funding flights to Minnesota to play. So it really, and to be intentional about that, because it can take its own trajectory. And so it doesn't mean you don't do it. It's just to be part of that. Then other things with kids are like private versus public schools. And then what we will be offering to support our child in terms of college expenses, you know, just to be intentional there. And I just had, I'll mention an example there. I had someone mention to me just recently, a client, and they said they were anchored by what their parents had done. And they said, our parents provided full funding for us to each to go to a private school. So of course we have to offer that to our children. And I said, you know, I don't know that you have to. I want it to be an intentional choice, you know, is to not make assumptions or get too caught in prior anchors.
Yes, absolutely. So any final thoughts before you leave us today?
Yes, I'm going to briefly just mention something that comes up a lot with couples. You know, in married life, there's a lot of individual spending that takes place. And it's a space where there can still be some continued conflict. And so if a couple really has good stuff in place, like you and your husband do, and you're in agreement on the major spending, I like to break down the actual day-to-day spending or a routine, the spending, into three categories. First is the lowest level, don't ask, don't tell. I'll explain more about these. Second is the FYI category. And the third is to collaborate before we decide. And so the don't ask, don't tell, that's like the individual things we spend on ourselves. That's like if I'm in charge of grocery shopping, if someone's in charge of filling the gas in the car. So we don't necessarily say, oh, by the way, it cost me $42.73 to fill the gas tank. And someone else shouldn't be critical of it either. And some nitpicking can happen here, because even in individual spending, sometimes we agree to something, but it still isn't what we would do. And I'll give you a quick example is my husband loves to get the cars washed. It's his thing. And so yesterday when I was here at work, through my phone, my credit card shows me what's hitting it. And so I see the expense to get the car washed, and he goes for the deluxe one. And I automatically have a trigger, and then I say, don't ask, don't tell. That's his, because if I do that will just create conflict where it's unnecessary. Second category, though, that FYI, is if I stick with the car thing, is let's say my husband takes the car to get inspected and it needs new brakes and a few other things. If there's going to be a bigger bill, is of course he can act on his own there. He's capable of that. It's in his domain of responsibility. But a good FYI to say is, oh, hey, by the way, there's going to be this extra big charge on the credit card, just so it doesn't surprise. The final category, though, on the collaboration, that's those things where no one should act without collaborating with the other one. That would be like a purchase of a new car. Like if my husband came home and said, oh, by the way, I traded in the car and got a new one, I would be allowed to yell then. I would have every...
Absolutely.
So I just encourage couples to keep it that way so that there's not this conflictual nitpicking or gaslighting each other, with surprises.
Well, Nancy, this was another wonderful session filled with great information. So I thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Certainly.
I look forward to our final session on children and finance.
Yes. Yeah.
That we're going to have next month. So thank you again. I hope you have a great day.
Well, certainly, you too. Look forward to talking. Bye-bye.